Thank you for attending NetSPI's Threat and Vulnerability Management educational webinar that will provide you with tools and techniques to support you in measuring your organization's security maturity. I'm excited and honored to introduce Bill Carver. Bill is a 20-year cybersecurity expert, and his background is truly unique because it comes from both the client side and he's now over on the security consulting side. So inside of his experience, he's had both at the financial industries as well as pharmaceuticals, working for both Citi as well as Merck Pharmaceuticals. Now, this experience really provides him the ability to understand both the internal challenges that organizations face every day, day in and day out, but then on top of that, his security consulting experience has truly given him a diverse exposure to multiple different types of industries as well as those challenges that are being experienced by those. So with that, Bill's really gotten a solid foundation to ensure organizations are truly taking a pragmatic approach as well as a holistic approach to their threat and vulnerability management that ultimately improves the organization's security posture. And so with that, I'd like to hand it off to Bill Carver to start today's webinar. Bill?
Perfect. Thanks, Mary. And thanks, everyone, for attending. Quickly, just want to go over our agenda for today and cover our topics at a very high level. We're going to touch on who is NetSPI, just briefly for those of you who may not know who we are. And then to get into our webinar, we're really going to dive into what the top 5 questions are that you need to ask your organization. It's going to be an interesting exercise to try to understand where you rank within sort of the threat and vulnerability management program spectrum. Then we're going to talk about threat and vulnerability management program approach, and lastly, but maybe most importantly, just really around where you can go from here when we're done, right? We're going to try to give you some useful information that you can take back to your organization and apply. So certainly very important for us to kind of hit on that as we wrap up. So just very quickly, from a who is NetSPI perspective, right? So we're headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We have offices all over the country. We've been around since 2001, and really our purpose has been to build a premier enterprise security testing company, right? From this mission, we've really evolved into not only providing security testing from a professional services perspective, but also developing our NetSPI Resolve platform to help meet our internal testing needs and market needs as well as it relates to orchestrating the vulnerability management lifecycle. We're 80 employees strong. We have over 50 security consultants, and as we continue to grow, we are dedicated to ensuring that we have the most elite experts within our ranks. We're trusted by 6 of the top 10 banks and some of the largest public cloud providers. So our portfolio is really tailored to the needs of the Global 5000. We specialize in the most regulated and compliance-driven industries. It includes financial institutions, healthcare, retail, and technology. So certainly well positioned to be able to help with your needs. With that, frankly, that's all the sales pitch you're going to get, right? Get it out of the way in the beginning. We're ready to roll. Let's go ahead and get into the good stuff, right? So I thought a lot about how best to start this session, and really I think it helps to use real world examples as much as you can, right, to kind of get people thinking about things that are really most applicable to them and things that maybe they've seen and heard before. So I think we start off with this scenario, and I think it will help frame up the rest of our discussion. So imagine this for a minute, right? This is something that's happened to me before. It's happened to clients that I work with. It's 11 p.m. On a Saturday, and there's a new threat that's sort of gaining traction and visibility. It's starting to hit the news, social media, and you're aware of it. You're scrambling a little bit to kind of assess where your company stands and how you're doing. And then you get a text from your boss, and the text just simply says, "Hey, I heard about, insert threat here, and it sounds like it's a really big deal. Are we okay?" Right? So in all honesty, most people answer that question equal parts truth and some leaps of faith. You might say, we're good, but really based on what? How confident are you feeling that that's really a good answer, right? Well, filling in those gaps and being able to better respond to that text is really what we're hoping to give you today, right? Some really thoughtful, pragmatic approaches, real-world scenarios to how you can better respond. A lot of companies do technical testing, and then they just fall very short on connecting the dots from a program perspective. And why? Really, because connecting the dots, that's the hard part. Technical testing, if you're within a silo, it's something that you can do, and generally it's owned by the security department, and it doesn't require working with a lot of other teams until you start to connect the dots. And we'll talk a lot about what that looks like and why that's so important. So let's talk about how well prepared you are to deal with all of the threats that we're facing every day, because we know that there's a million of them out there, right? We're going to ask a few simple questions to try to determine where you stand today. And while this certainly doesn't cover everything, I think that by the time we go through these questions and you answer them, you'll have a better understanding of where you really stand with your threat and vulnerability management program. So question number one is, do you have methods defined for reviewing and determining actions needed for technical vulnerabilities when they become known? And do you have capabilities to ensure these processes are working as designed? Let you think about that for a minute. Do you have infrastructure and application vulnerability risk acceptance and tracking capabilities? Do you ensure the right people within the organization are handling risk decisions? Do you have established threat intelligence and incident response capabilities? And are they aligned with a comprehensive threat and vulnerability management program? Do you have an established SDLC process that includes security checkpoints and testing? Do you conduct business impact analysis to evaluate the criticality of applications and infrastructure with well-defined ownership and accountability of all information assets? So again, these questions, just trying to frame up where do we fit on the maturity curve, right? In a perfect world, you've answered an emphatic yes to all of those questions. And we all know we don't live in a perfect world. So if so, you'd really be in a minority. Most organizations fall in the middle of that maturity curve. Some have even further to go, and there are very few that are really at the high end of the spectrum. At the lower end of the spectrum, right, you might have a lack of asset configuration and management processes. Threat intelligence doesn't really integrate with your vulnerability and patch management programs. There's no defined processes for evaluating technical vulnerabilities. And really, you don't have an ability to effectively react to incidents. That's at the very low end of the maturity curve. On the higher end, right, you've got a clear picture of where your critical assets are. You've got defined and repeatable processes to respond to threats. You have solid capabilities for evaluating technology risks and plans for action. And there's risk management processes in place with the right folks involved to be able to handle those situations where maybe something has come up where you're not able to take the course of action that you would like to, right? So really my experience has been that most organizations tend to think that they're a little bit better at all this threat and vulnerability management stuff than they really are. But the good news is that regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, there is definitely work that can be done. It's just a matter of determining what's right, what's right for your organization, what's the right type and maturity of threat and vulnerability management program for you. The right program just needs to be driven by the needs of the business, your risk appetite, and frankly, just a lot of common sense. I mentioned before that connecting the dots and establishing an effective threat and vulnerability management program is really hard to do, and well, it's true, and you're not alone in those challenges. So now let's really get into the meat of what some of those challenges are, and then talk about some ways that we can try to get around these challenges and get better with our threat and vulnerability management program, right? So first and foremost, right, there's an issue with time. Much of what needs to be done to have an effective threat and vulnerability management program simply requires time, and it requires time from people who are already underwater, and in many cases, their primary responsibility is not information security. That's an important point, something I'll come back to as we go through our session today, is that a lot of times these groups that are working together, the folks that are responsible for doing the work that needs to be done to help improve your posture, security isn't their primary responsibility. It's very important to kind of keep that in mind. Disconnected tools. Most organizations have lots of tools, right? They ultimately don't always work very well together in a complementary manner, and then we end up not being able to yield our desired outcomes, right? So we have our disconnected tools, don't provide us all the value that they should. We're not getting the value out of that tool set. Lots of tools that are disjointed, they don't work together. We don't get the metrics and reporting that we need, and ultimately all of this confusion makes it very difficult for us to get better with our program. Partnership amongst teams, right? In order to have an effective TVM program, it requires communication and teamwork among a lot of different teams. And a lot of times these teams have different reporting lines. They have different bosses, different competing needs. It makes it very challenging. When we start to look at the framework, I think this will become really obvious that a lot of these groups really, they're just by nature, they're not working very closely together. So that certainly presents a challenge. Senior leadership awareness. A lot of times, senior security leaders just lack the tools and data necessary to communicate their program effectiveness to their leadership and to the board. In many cases, they themselves come from a very technical background. They may struggle with communicating to company leaders, and they might just simply not have the visibility into the program that they should because of all of the other challenges that we described around how disjointed the groups can be and how disjointed the tools can be, et cetera. And then one of the big ones, resources. Organizations just, it's very hard to find people today, very hard to find people that have the right skill sets to bring all this together. It really requires a unique set of skills across the board from technical to non-technical. And frankly, it's just not easy to get the right people into the right roles or even being able to find the right people. So it's just a big challenge, as I'm sure most of you are aware, just finding the right people to help get the job done. But again, these challenges are common across the board. And again, we're going to talk about some ways that we might be able to help improve the program, knowing what some of those challenges are. Now that you know where you think you rank, where do you go from here? Well, here's how we think about threat and vulnerability management at NetSPI and the things that we consider. Going back to the example I used in the beginning, how can you truthfully and confidently respond to that text if these elements that are outlined here within our framework are not being addressed and if they're not at a certain level of maturity, and really more importantly, if these things aren't all working together across people, process, and technology? All of these things are needed, right? When we look at asset management, configuration management, software development security, vulnerability and patch management, incident response, threat intelligence, technical testing, all of this needs to work in harmony to have a good program. And this is where, as you'll see, this is where it gets really challenging, especially if you're in the information security department and you look at some of these things, what likely comes to mind right away is that you don't necessarily own all of these things, right? So while I might be the group, right, information security, that function is typically the group that who are people going to go to when it comes to threat and vulnerability management? They're going to go to the information security team typically. When you look at a lot of these different disciplines, they don't reside within information security. So, well, gosh, how am I supposed to bring it all together, right? That's very difficult. A lot of these people in these groups, they don't report either up under me or into my boss. We have separate lines of reporting. It all gets very challenging. And one of the things that I'm going to recommend several times as we go throughout the rest of our session here is that when you look at this, to me, this is why it becomes painfully apparent that one of the most important things that we can do is just have somebody who is responsible for threat and vulnerability management. Now, I realize that in all organizations it's not going to be reasonable to just have somebody dedicated to that function. And in some cases it might be, but in some cases it won't. But at least if you have somebody with the responsibility, somebody that you can go to, instead of having to reach out directly to the program leader for asset management, for configuration management, for software security, software development security, right? So having somebody that you can go to who really, I call them the TVM quarterback, the threat and vulnerability management quarterback, that can be a really, really important role, and it can be something that you can do without a tremendous amount of expense, but then just somebody who has responsibility for the program, who can help connect the dots, who works directly with all of those primary stakeholders. So I'll mention that again, probably a couple times as we go throughout the rest of the session here, but wanted to make sure that was a recommendation that was kind of at the forefront of your mind. So when we look at these different program elements, I just want to take a minute if you're wondering, okay, we've outlined what these program elements are. How do they all play into the threat and vulnerability management program puzzle? How do they ultimately all work together? And really importantly, we're going to touch on some things that really would indicate a level of maturity within these areas. So if you're not only thinking about, well, do we have these programs in place as we're outlining what the programs are, but also within each one of these, what are some things that maybe we should be thinking about? And hopefully some things here will really resonate. Maybe there's some things in here that you hadn't considered before, but we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about how all of these things really work together, what a little bit about maturity looks like within these different areas. So as we get into that, first off, let's start with asset management, really. This is, do we know what's important to the business? Where does it reside? Who owns the data? Very simply put, do we know what we care about and why? This gets missed in a lot of organizations. A great way to accomplish this is by conducting a business impact analysis. If you haven't done that, there's certainly other things that you can do, but a business impact analysis really gives you a great way to align applications and systems and assets back to business processes and revenue generation and compliance requirements and things of that nature. So business impact analysis is a great way to do this, but if nothing else, do we have an inventory of assets? And that's everything, operating systems, ancillary software, web applications, mobile apps, physical assets, right? Do we know who owns the assets? Who can help us make decisions about risk? Understanding the criticality, how do all of our assets tie to business processes, regulatory, financial, and reputational risk, right? It all really starts with that when you think about how do we address vulnerabilities and then respond to threats. It's very, very critical to understand what your asset profile looks like. When we think about configuration management, how do we make sure systems and software are constructed in a secure manner and that we introduce them into production in a way that we expect them to be introduced? We have to maintain integrity. This starts with simple things like having hardening standards. So if we've done asset management, we know what types of assets we have and all the different technologies. Do we have documented hardening standards for all of those things? And had they been developed working between information security and the subject matter experts that know the technology? And that's something that's very important, because what I've seen in a lot of organizations is you'll have hardening standards that have been developed by one group or the others. So you've got a team of security professionals with that kind of laser-focused security mindset, and then you have the technical subject matter experts. Maybe it's let's say your Windows servers admin group, right? And they look at things in a very different way. If one group is developing them in a silo, that can present some real challenges. It's very important for those two groups to work together to make sure that those hardening standards are defined in a way that they're not only secure, but they actually work for the business as well, and that everybody agrees to them, so that we can get to that idea of making sure that everything we introduce into production is built in the way that we've all agreed upon. And that's operating systems, network devices, web servers. Again, it's everything that you have within your environment. It really should have documented hardening standards. What's our process for the standard build, right? How do we make sure if we've got standards that we're building systems in a way that we should be, and that we have a way to verify as we're rolling those things into production that they're built the way that we want them to be? And then, just as importantly, change management, making sure that those things stay the way that they are, or the way that we expect them to, and if there are changes made, that they've been approved and we have good control over that environment. Having a configuration management database and configuration management tools, that obviously gets to the higher end of maturity. But again, thinking about all these things and how they work together, from defining your assets to making sure that they're configured in a way that we want them to be and expect them to be, to things like software development security. Are we building software applications in a secure manner? That's what we really want to ask ourselves. Are developers periodically trained and tested in secure code development? That's one of probably the most foundational elements that we want to make sure is in place. Is there a well-defined and followed SDLC process with security checkpoints? Is the security team part of that process? seen in a lot of organizations where, oh, we've got an SDLC, we've got some security checkpoints, but the checkpoints were built by developers and there's no integration with the security team. Talking about how these groups have to work together, that's another one where it's imperative for these two groups to be talking together. Are we considering security architecture and threat assessments? Are developers given necessary tools to test their applications? We want to empower as a security team. It's great if you can empower the development team to make it part of their standard processes. Security is just another thing that we need to do when we build an application. Let's help them with tools to be able to do that. So, for example, if they have the ability and we have the tools to give them where they can actually test their applications at various points during the SDLC from a security perspective, making them more proactive and then engaging the security team maybe for, hey, I see some things here. Can you help me understand what these are? Can you help me understand how best to fix these problems? But just really, giving them tools to empower them to do more testing. And then do we have proper controls between development, test, and production? And then one of the most critical elements here, right, our vulnerability and patch management. How do we monitor and manage vulnerabilities and their remediation activities? So many things that we see. This is where a lot breaks down with a lot of companies, right? It's so important in this area, touching on that theme of groups working together again, is that not only do we need to know about all the different technologies we have so that we can best address vulnerabilities as they become known and make sure that we are monitoring for those things on a continual basis, but it's so very critical, I think, in this area for the technology subject matter experts who are assigned to specific types of technology within the environment to be able to work alongside with an information security function to address vulnerabilities as they become known. This is another one where just working in silos is not a very good thing. These two groups working together to say, you've got a security professional that can help understand, well, okay, it's Patch Tuesday. Here's what we're dealing with. Here's the 5 patches from Microsoft and how they've rated them and why they've rated them that way. Let's have a methodology and work together to do what's best for our organization. Just because Microsoft says something is critical doesn't mean it's critical for us. That's a conversation that really needs to happen, but it needs to happen, again, in conjunction, those two groups working together to say, well, you've got subject matter experts that know the environment best, that know your specific environment and the applications and the infrastructure, and then working with security experts that understand how those vulnerabilities may be taken advantage of, right? Work together to figure out, what does this really mean to us? Is it critical? Maybe it's a medium risk. Maybe we can adjust. So not always following, certainly understanding and listening to the vendor recommendations, but understanding how these things are really applicable to your environment and working across those two groups to ultimately come up with a methodology that makes sure that you're spending time fixing things that are important to you and that you're not spending time, or even worse, spending time maybe causing issue, breaking things with things that really aren't as important to your business. Determining the SLAs, once we've gone through that process, let's all sit down and agree. If the groups don't sit down and agree up front about what's going to work for everyone, then you end up with a security team or testing team, if they're not part of security, a testing team that's constantly knocking on the door of the technology administrators and saying, hey, you've got to fix this, you've got to fix that, you've got to fix this, you've got to fix that. And nobody's really sat down and said, well, no, we've all agreed to this, and this is what we're going to do and how we're going to remediate vulnerabilities of a specific nature or ranking. All that needs to be predetermined and groups working together. And then really just understanding risk mitigation strategies and how that impacts how you address vulnerability remediation. And then, lastly on the vulnerability and patch management front is just the criticality of reporting and communication. It's so important that not only the different groups are working together, as I mentioned, but that there is a ton of visibility into what's happening in that world, because what far too often happens is you end up with what I call the siloed tech conversation, information security tech, working with system admins, and it stays at this level. Maybe there's a little bit of communication outward, but it doesn't reach the level that it needs to. In a lot of cases, senior leadership needs to be aware of what's happening in this space. You have to determine what the right way to get them that information is and how they want it and how they really read and respond to it best. But a big problem when it comes to addressing this challenge around vulnerability and patch management just can be the visibility. It needs to be broader. People need to understand what's going on. There needs to be no surprises. So I can't kind of stress that that piece enough. All right, next in a framework here that we want to consider is our technical testing, using tools and manual techniques and third parties in some cases to test infrastructure and applications both internally and externally. Let's make sure that we're prioritizing what needs to be tested. Do we have defined testing methods? That might be internal and external testing, infrastructure and application, authenticated, unauthenticated, vulnerability versus pen testing, red team, adversarial simulation. How frequently are we testing? What type of reporting are we doing, right? This is a cornerstone, certainly, the technical testing, but this is typically the area that we see organizations gravitate toward because it is generally run by an information security team. Very easy for that team to, to conduct the testing, but then a lot of times we see this happening, and then none of these other components that we're talking about. And while it's critical and it's an important step, and we have to do it, right? And it's a logical first step. It's one where, again, we want to take a step back and say, well, what do we do now? A really good example of connecting the dots, right, is one time I remember a pen test that was performed, and the results were given to the Windows sysadmins, and as they got the report, they looked at, it's lit up like a Christmas tree. They're looking at the report and they're saying, well, this is all well and good, but how should we have known which things we were to address, which things we weren't to address? You run this report, you kind of throw it on our desk. Are we just supposed to go and fix all this stuff? Boy, I mean, this is complicated. You see there that by not having a methodology to review vulnerabilities, not working with the right teams to agree on what the right approach and SLAs are, that can really result in a big challenge. Whereas if the groups are talking together, you run that test now, you should be able to match that up to your vulnerability database and understand, well, no, here's exactly what we did. We rated this vulnerability, here's what we rated it, here was the SLA, and yes, this needs to be remediated. It's a little bit, black and white, and it's not always that way, but that's an example of how not having those groups communicating together can cause problems. So, okay, threat intelligence. A big part of bringing all this together, right? Threat and vulnerability management. It's imperative to understand and monitor threats, monitor our environment, and make sure, this is the critical piece, of just making sure that people responsible for threat intel ops, if that's your SOC, they're connected with the other parts of the threat and vulnerability management program. Monitoring threats for all things that are relevant to your environment. Are there proper communication channels between threat intel and other necessary stakeholders? And that can even include the general employee population. Sometimes threats, right, might be targeting the general population. Well, how do we get it from the SOC to the people that need to know? A good example, I think, of how threat intelligence plays a critical role in this TVM framework is that, let's say, for example, we do have a mature program to evaluate vulnerabilities and then determine remediation SLAs, right? We had this program in place. Something came down the pike 6 months ago. We looked, information security team working with the subject matter experts, used the methodology. They looked at the vulnerability and said, okay, well, given that this needs, it needs local access to be exploited, it needs this, it needs that, we really don't, we've got some mitigating controls. We really don't think that this is a critical vulnerability for us at this time. We're going to rate this a medium, which means we're giving ourselves X amount of time, maybe even when we rated it a low. And then time passes, and then all of a sudden there's a threat, something in the wild that takes advantage of that vulnerability. It completely changes how you looked at it initially. Are those groups talking together to immediately be able to react to that? So, hey, based on what we're seeing, this is now changing from maybe a low to a high or a medium to a critical. We need to change what our approach was. We may need to expand the systems that we applied remediation to. There could be any number of things that need to happen, but if those groups aren't talking and that bridge isn't there, the system is going to, the program is going to break down, right at that point. And then finally, if all things don't work as planned, how well can we respond, right, when it didn't go the way that we wanted it to? Do we have well-documented charters and policies, standards and processes? Very, very critical in the incident response area. I generally am not one who's in favor of the, having the paper tigers, right? We've got very well-documented processes, but we don't actually do anything. In the case of incident response, this is one area where it's critical just because of the nature and stress and the intensity of what happens when things maybe go off the rails a little bit, that having something that's well-defined is super critical to just keep things on track. Conducting tabletop exercises, having crisis management plans, incident response retainers, if that's something that works for your organization, cyber insurance as well. So all of these things working together, this framework, right, you start to see that if we laid out some of those things that indicate maturity and things that we should be considering, if all of these things are happening and working together, I feel that to a certain level of confidence and a pretty high level of confidence that I'm able to respond, that I'm able to answer the question. I've got my threat and vulnerability management quarterback. These areas are communicating well and working well, with each other. That gives me that level of confidence. And just quickly, some additional themes that you should consider as part of the framework. They're really underpinnings that spread throughout these different elements. Metrics, reporting, visibility, just how do we make sure in all these different areas that the right information is getting to the right people. And lastly, there's a huge risk management element to all of this as well, right? When we're not able to remediate vulnerabilities in the way that we expect or want to, how do we take technology risk for a system and application and convert that into business risk and ultimately make sure the right people are signing off on risk? I can't tell you how many times I've seen that occur just within the IT group or just within security, when realistically, if you're thinking about not applying a fix for a vulnerability, maybe it's a medium risk, maybe it's a high risk, you're thinking about not applying a fix to that. And when you think about what that system may ultimately support and the risk that presents, in many cases, if you really start to break it down and think about the financial impact, compliance impact, maybe there's a reputational impact, what were to happen if this technical vulnerability were ultimately exploited? Kind of take that threat scenario down the line and realize, hey, I'm just the security guy. I shouldn't be accepting this level of risk, but it happens all the time. So there's this risk management element to all this as well. How do we get the right information? How do we convert it into language that the business folks can understand? And then how do we get the right people to make the right decisions about risk? Certainly very, very critical component that underpins all this that we don't want to forget. So when we think about the framework, one thing that can certainly be effective, and as we start thinking about, well, what can we do, right? What can we do within our organization to start to look at these different program areas and measure where we're at? Here's an example of a scorecard that you can use, looking across the organization and measuring across people, process, technology, our seven different program elements. Quickly, you could use something like this to give yourself a starting point. Okay, let's find out where we're at today. We've got our 5 questions. We've talked a lot about the different program elements and what maturity elements are. We could really quickly define, okay, how do we look in these different areas? Are we red, yellow, green, and come up with a starting point, and then ultimately prioritized activities to get better, right? Along those fronts, what's next? Hopefully you're walking away from our session here today with useful information that you can apply within your organization. Ask yourself, how well positioned are you to respond? Go back to the text after hearing all of this. Compare your program or your program elements today to the NetSPI framework. Do we have these programs in place? Do we have all 7 areas covered? If we do, how well are they really working? What are we missing? Are there things that we can do? Maybe we're missing an element. Oh boy, we're really we don't have that vulnerability and patch management methodology. Hey, well, let's build that. That's something that we can do. Doesn't take a ton of time. We can sit down with our subject matter experts and build something like that. And do an internal review of how well these different program elements are connected in the business. are all of the dots connected? If you think that you've got the program elements, are they all talking to each other? Do we have that threat and vulnerability management quarterback? Really, it's just take the framework back and just apply it to your organization and just understand, number one, do we have the elements? If we don't have them, what makes sense potentially for us to consider building out? If we have them, how well are they working? If you think you're at a very high level of maturity, you've listened to much of this and you said, oh boy, we've got this pretty well covered. We feel like we're in good shape. In a lot of cases, it's still very beneficial to just sit down, find all the owners for those different areas, sit down in a room for half a day, and talk about the framework. And sometimes you might be very surprised what comes out of those discussions. While we might have program owners or we might be doing all these things, using the framework to have a guided discussion sometimes might just reveal that, oh, well, no, maybe we do have a gap here. Maybe there's some communication points that aren't working just as effectively as we thought they were, right? There's a lot of different ways you can apply it. Even, highly mature, a lot of room for improvement, regardless of where you stand, whether you have plenty of budget, said no one ever, or no budget, you can use this information to help your organization improve at managing vulnerabilities and responding to threats. If nothing else, if the program really, if it does or doesn't exist today in your environment, the idea of assigning responsibility and having greater communication is something to spend some time thinking about. If you don't have that threat and vulnerability management quarterback, I'll say it again, is that one really is super critical. Having a person to connect all the dots, it's something that really shouldn't have a tremendous impact from a budgeting perspective. So certainly think about that one there. But there's a lot to do using the tools that we provided you today to take back to your organization, regardless of where you're at on the maturity scale. So with that, I just wanted to take a second to thank everyone for their time, and we're going to answer a few questions from the audience. We want to be mindful of everyone's time, so if there are questions that we just happen not to get to, we'll contact you directly on those. So thanks again for the time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bill. We definitely appreciate all the information and the insights that you provided during today's webinar. A couple of the questions that have just been rolling in, and it looks like our queue is filling pretty quickly. So first question is, my patch management, technical testing, and software development groups are in silos. How do I get started with a program like this? What would you recommend, Bill?
Great question, and certainly a common problem, right? So if I understand correctly, the technical testing team in many cases is a information security function, or very closely aligned with information security, and then software development in a lot of cases purely residing under the IT functions. So really, when you like I said, it's a very common problem. This one is more a relationship and a communication challenge than anything else. It's very important for the leaders of those two groups to have a relationship, to understand how those two groups can work together to make each other's lives better by understanding each other's business, right? Very, very important that they understand that. And I say that because if that doesn't exist, so if that's not coming from the top down within software development and within the information security group, then you can have an adversarial relationship. The silos just get worse. The walls get thicker. Maybe you're testing but you're not getting response, and it really creates a challenging situation. So I'd say the security professionals generally know that there's tremendous benefits to baking security in early on within the development process, but that's not always obvious to testers. Likewise, as security professionals, we oftentimes don't understand the challenges that the software developers face. So it really does need to be kind of a bridging of the gap between the two groups, starting with their leaders to better understand, hey, how do we work together? How do we make each other's life better? Understand my business. I want to understand your business. It really is more of a relationship challenge than a technical one, because we all know what to do technically in that scenario. we know how to test applications. The dev folks know how to develop them. It really just becomes a matter of how do we work together to bake security in early on, what are the benefits of doing that, and it's a lot about relationships and communication. So hopefully that helps.
Perfect. Thanks, Bill. So then the next question is, I have received that text more recently regarding the Spectre Meltdown, and I'm skeptical on the accuracy of my response. What would you recommend me doing as a next step?
Besides turning your phone off on a weekend, nope, jokes aside, it's another good question. First thing I think I'd ask yourself is just what made you feel less than confident in your response? So now that you're familiar with the framework and the things that all need to work together, potentially it's a different way for you to look at the problem than maybe you have in the past. You can look at the framework and maybe it might become apparent what elements are missing or what elements have areas where we have gaps or things have broken down. So now having that, it might be good to go back, use that example and say, okay, why was I less than confident in my response? And it might just become painfully obvious that, oh, you know what? We didn't have great communication from our threat intel group and the vulnerability and patch management team. Well, of course, I didn't feel confident, right? Something became known in the wild. We've got this threat. I'm getting a text, and I know that, yeah, you know, we've got these programs in place, but I know that those two groups really aren't working well together, and there's not a great line of communication. That might be something you can look at right away, and you might be able to understand why you're getting that feeling and maybe even find ways to fix that pretty quickly and easily.
Okay, great. And then the last question, because I know we're going to be running short on time today, so if there are additional questions, definitely email us. But the last question for today is, I'm strapped for resources to complete an in-depth program assessment. What do you suggest? So I guess, Bill, where would you think that they should go first and foremost as they're struggling with that resource piece?
Sure. Well, let's see. So I think I'd recommend using the framework to identify which programs exist and which ones do not, first and foremost. From there, you can determine the feasibility of developing those that don't and prioritizing. For the elements that you do have in place, identify the primary owners for those functions. I go back to setting up that half-a-day internal team workshop to review the framework and just determine how well the programs are working together. How well are we communicating? If we have gaps, let's address them. Like I mentioned before, sometimes just getting the folks in a room for a guided discussion, it can yield a lot more information than you might imagine. Having that framework, putting it up on the screen and talking through those different elements. We've talked at a high level about what some of those maturity elements are within those 7 different areas. So just sometimes putting it up there on the screen and talking through those things really can yield a lot of information. I can almost guarantee that if you did that, you would walk out of that session with 4 or 5 things that you could tackle, and they don't always have to be, very, cost prohibitive, lengthy endeavors to go on. There might just be some simple things that you can do. Hey, let's establish a threat and vulnerability management quarterback and set up a monthly meeting for all of the groups that we do have to get together and talk. Right? There's so much value in doing that. So just again, don't underestimate the value of having those conversations. But I do think the framework provides you that great sort of backdrop for that conversation.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Bill. And thank you to our audience today. We definitely appreciate your time, participation, and attention. If there are any additional follow-up questions or if you need help inside of going through and really understanding what your threat and vulnerability management program looks like in your maturity, please feel free to reach out to NetSPI. We put up our email address at info@netspy.com. You can also check us out at our website, www.netspy.com. And then underneath security testing, you'll see advisory services, and so you can learn a little bit more about NetSPI's program as well. So with that, we'll close out today's webinar, but thanks again for everybody's time. Bye-bye.